Hi, my name is John Paul Fitzgerald. I suppose to start the presentation tonight, just a quick outline of the presentation, just a quick background and overview and then moving on to the GDA transport strategy and some of the corridor studies that were undertaken to support this, giving a kind of an outline description and looking at some of the proposals. Some of the public transport proposals. Then I'll look at an example study which outlines kind of the looking at the aims and objectives of the study, as well outlining the methodology of the assessment undertaken, as well as modelling the proposals. And then finally, Sinead will discuss the demand management proposals underpinning the GDA transport strategy. Introduction. Jacobs and Systra provide transport planning and modelling services to the NTA under a number of transport planning and modelling frameworks. Recently we've been involved in the development of the regional transport modelling system, which is currently going to be launched nationwide by the NTA. So the regional modelling system, I suppose it replaces the previous DTO model with an Eastern regional model which covers most of Leinster, and it also focuses on Cork in the Southwest regional model, Waterford City in the Southeast regional model, Limerick in the Midwest regional model, and Galway in the West Northwest regional model. The Eastern regional model was recently utilised to support the GDA transport strategy. Now, this transport strategy is the first transport strategy to receive approval and sign off by ministerial approval and sign off, which gives it it means it's a statutory framework for the development of transport infrastructure and services for the coming 20 years. I suppose in developing this transport strategy, Jacobs and Systra worked on a number of studies to support this. These included the Southeast Corridor, the West Corridor, the Southwest Fringe, and the Metropolitan Inner Orbital Corridor. Other studies included the GDA Park and Ride, and also GDA Demand Management. And all these reports are online on the National Transport Authority's website for you to review. I suppose this is just an outline of the corridors that we looked at. So there's the Southeast Corridor going from Greystones through Bray, Dunleary, all the way up to the Canal Cordon, the Dublin City Canal Cordon. The green area is the Southwest Fringe, which covers kind of the areas of Firhouse and Old Bawn outside the M50 and to the south of the N81. The navy study area is the Metropolitan Inner Orbital study area, pretty much focusing on orbital movements inside the M50 but outside the canal, the Dublin City Canal Cordon, and the West Corridor, which focuses on kind of just the West Corridor out towards Lucan, and I suppose the key public transport proposals that came about as a result of these studies. You can see for the Southeast Corridor, one of the keys, the key elements is an extension of the Lewis line from Cherrywood to Bray, as well as an upgrading of this line to a metro status, particularly within the near the city centre urban context, where it becomes grade separated. There's also the Western Corridor. Looked at a provision of a Lewis line from the city centre out towards Lucan. The Metropolitan Inner Orbital Corridor proposed orbital bus services, two bus services. You can see the pink and the blue lines there, to cater for a kind of a diffuse and disperse demand and catchment. And the Southwest Fringe, the proposal was to extend the proposed BRT from Clongriff, so that it routed through Firhouse and Old Bawn back up into Tallaght, where it would interchange with the existing Lewis. I suppose a worked example I'm going to show you is going to focus on the Southeast Corridor. So this again is the Southeast Corridor study area. The Key public transport provision at the moment is the rail line, including the Dart line from Greystones to Bray through Dunleary to the city centre. There's also the existing Lewis line through Dundrum, Sandyford down to Cherrywood, as well as existing bus services throughout the network to complement the existing road network, the M11, the N11 and the M50. Objectives of the corridor was to develop public transport measures that will cater for the existing public transport usage, that would cater for 100% of future demand growth to Dublin city centre from the corridor, and would also cater for more of the existing car-based demand if feasible. So the methodology for undertaking this study, in the first instance, it was to establish demand and establish growth. So, we looked at the 2011 base year demand, and we forecasted to 2035 using the Eastern Regional Model. This allowed us to understand the level of demand growth that we needed to cater for, as well as the existing demand. Then, second step was to identify potential public transport options. So it was based on capacity thresholds and the ability to carry the forecast demand. The options considered heavy rail, light rail, BRT buses, and different combinations of each of them. The third step then was to assess the feasibility of these options, and these were assessed under the 5 Common Appraisal Framework criteria of economy, safety, environment, accessibility and social inclusion. And the fourth step then was the testing of the preferred option within the Eastern Regional Model, confirming the effectiveness in serving the required demand by public transport. So I suppose the first step was to establish the demand. So the forecast demand was established in terms of screen lines across the study area, working from the bottom of the study area northbound until we got to the edge of the study area at the city centre canal. This demand takes into account of demand coming from the south of the study area, demand that starts our demand with an origin and a destination within the study area, and also demand that has a destination within the city centre and beyond the city centre as well. So we were able to determine the split of this demand. So you can see the blue bars represent the demand that across each screen line that's going to the city centre. Sorry, the demand growth that's going to the city centre. The purple bars represent the demand that has a destination within the study area, and the green bars represent the demand that has a destination actually beyond the city centre. And it was the aim was to try and cater for all of this demand through public transport measures. So I suppose one of the main points, you can see screen line number 3 here. There's a total demand of 4,700 crossing this screen line. So it's just to the south of Dundrum and Sandyford and Dunleary, and just north of Cherrywood. I suppose the public transport service capacities then were considered in relation to developing optional transport measures that would achieve these targets. Again, these were based on a design capacity. The design capacity was set at approximately 85% of the crush capacity of these public transport services. Now, the crush capacity, on public transport services, you've seated capacity, and then you've the standing capacity on top of that as well. So we aimed for less than 80% of the crushed standing capacity. So I suppose just to give a context, if you were to provide a brand new Dart line as such and ran a Dart service every 15 minutes, that would equate to 4,760 passengers. Similarly, if you were to run a brand new commuter line that ran every 6 minutes, this would equate to just over 4,000 passengers. Similarly, light rail with I believe that's a 53 metre tram, 4 or 5 minute frequencies, you're looking at 3,000 to 3,900 passengers, whereas a segregated light rail with longer carriages can cater for a greater demand. So it was using these public transport services that we developed a kind of just a palette of different combinations of public transport proposals that we looked at. So the next steps now, I'm going to show kind of 3 of the options that were focused on. So the first option was to look at DART enhancements on the existing line. In addition to proposing additional public transport services, it was also a chance to get more out of the existing services and the existing assets, to sweat the assets, as it were. So DART enhancements, if you can increase the DART service, with 4 additional trams, you'll get plus an additional commuter service. You can get up to 2,000 additional passengers in the morning peak. The existing, the existing enhancements to the existing Luas line, providing an additional two trams, and increasing the existing tram lengths from 43 metre trams to 53 metre trams, allowed you to increase the patronage numbers by 1,500. In addition to this, option 1 also looked at an extension of the Luas to Bray, and also a potential Luas spur that would access the city centre via Rathfarnham and Terranure. And in addition to this, then there was feeder bus services provided to provide access to the DART and to potentially the light rail. The second option then, again, it retained some of the aspects of the other one, particularly in terms of sweating the existing assets. So again, it's enhancements to the existing DART services, enhancements to the existing Luas, plus the provision of extending the proposed BRT from UCD out to Cherrywood, with a potential extension of that, of either the Luas or the BRT further south to Bray. And the third option then was to, again, it involved the DART enhancements to the existing services and upgrading of the Luas to Metro to provide a 2-minute frequency, and ensure that it was fully grade separated in the city centre. One of the key issues the Luas will have going forward, particularly in terms of increasing frequencies in the city centre, is its interaction with the existing traffic, the pedestrians, the cyclists, and the existing bus services within the city centre. To enable a 2-minute frequency on the Luas would detrimentally inhibit some of these the other modes as such. So going forward, grade separation within the city centre will ensure additional capacity can be gained and maintained, and the upgrade of the existing Luas to Metro will enable an additional 3,300 passengers to be catered for on the service line. And in addition to that, there's consideration for, again, feeder bus services to and Bray to allow the residents access to the improved services. So again, sifting appraisal was an appraisal was undertaken of these based on the 5 CAF appraisals: economy, environmental, safety, integration, and accessibility and social inclusion. And these were ranked and weighted. And out of this, option 3 was brought forward as the preferred option. And this was modelled as part of the GDA strategy under the 2035 forecast year. And now I'm just going to run through some of the modelling outputs some of the modelling outputs. I suppose in the first instance, what this graph is showing here is it shows the 2011 base public transport demand, which was one of our targets that we had to ensure that we maintained, that we were catering for this. Secondly, it shows the forecast growth that we'd shown earlier on top of this in the red bars. And the grey line then shows the modelled PT demand. I suppose one of the things to note is that, I suppose, the further south we go, we are catering for the majority of that forecast demand. We do we're not quite hitting it in the middle of the study area. However, at screen lines 4 and 5, we actually go above and beyond the forecast demand that we were set in terms of patronage to the city centre. As well, I suppose just some figures for the Metro and the DART services there. They both have similar distance to the city centre. I think this is coming from Bray. Journey times, you can see there's quite a bit of a difference in journey times. The DART still, because it's fully segregated and has far less stops, caters for a faster journey time than the Metro does. However, if you look at the travel distance in terms of passenger kilometres, you can see that the Metro caters for far more passenger kilometres than the DART. This is a passenger diagram for the Metro, starting at Bray to the south and finishing at Stephen's Green. The blue bars represent boardings. The red bars represent alightings where people are getting off. The yellow line represents the seated capacity of the Metro, and the red line represents the design capacity. So you can see, starting at Bray, there's a few hundred get on, and relatively consistently, well, maybe every second stop, there's a few hundred get on. By the time after 3 stops, passenger numbers are over 1,000. By the time we get to Carrickmines, we're over 2,000, and by the time we hit Stillorgan, the seating, it's standing room only, and this increases until we get into where we're crossing the canal, the canal cordon, where we've got over about 6,500 passengers on the Metro. This next one shows the DART passengers then, so you can see Bray and Shankill, quite a significant bump in passenger numbers initially, and again, you still have from Killiney, Dalkey, Glenageary, Dunleary, it's a few hundred passengers at every station, so that from Dunleary inbound in the morning peak, again, the seated capacity is taken up and it's standing room only. And again, by the time we get to screen line 5, which is roughly the kind of Sydney Parade, Sandymount line, you can see we're up at 4,000 passengers on the DART. So taking into account, sorry, I'll just skip back to this. You can see here that the existing PT demand is around 10,000. The forecast is 3,600. The combination of the Metro and the DART caters for 10,000 in and of itself, in just those two services, with the remainder of the GDA strategy public transport services such as BRT and the Dublin bus, and catering for the remaining 4,000. And for the southeast corridor, the mode share to the city centre from this is, when you're just looking at public transport in car, it's 60% public transport and 40% car. So again, you're seeing a shift away from car heavy demand to a public transport based service. And I suppose this slide here, again, it shows the context of the proposed southeast corridor proposals, the Metro South, the improvements to the existing DART service, in the context of the overall GDA transport strategies, looking at the BRT proposals, the continuation of Metro South via Metro North, going north through up to Dublin Airport and to Swords, the inner orbital bus services, the outer orbital bus services, the proposed LRT to Lucan, proposed extension of the Lewis Cross City from Broombridge out to Finglas, as well as the extension of the BRT via to Tala. So creating an overall quite an integrated public transport network for the GDA. I'll now pass you over to Sinead Kenny. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. In addition to preparing the Carter reports, as Jean-Paul has outlined, Jacobs and Cicero will also with preparing two separate reports, one being support for park and ride assessment, and the second being input into demand management and the role that it could play in the development of the strategy. So it's the demand management component that I'm going to go through in a little more detail tonight. And similar to the Carter report, the full demand management report is available on the NTA website as one of the supporting documents for the strategy. So within the strategy itself, the objective that was defined was that the strategy aims to provide an efficient and effective public transport system. And I suppose in similar developments to strategic planning, it's now being increasingly recognised that addressing public transport needs is not only a job of supply, as in the provision of infrastructure, but also in looking at issues that influence demand, and the role that demand management can play in providing for a more efficient and effective transport system, particularly when it comes to the economic efficiency of the strategy and getting best value out of the investment in both the existing transport infrastructure and also the investment in the proposed infrastructure within the transport strategy. And also to look at the aims of the strategy in terms of accommodating the future travel growth in a managed and a balanced way. So in addition to providing the infrastructure which Jean-Paul has outlined, there's also provision in the strategy for supplementary provision of demand management and park and ride to get greater use out of the investment in the public transport infrastructure. Bearing in mind that the focus of our work on the strategy was on trips that were greater than 3 kilometres in length, because it was a provision, it was set out as an assumption that for journeys of shorter length than 3 kilometres, that active modes would play the leading role in providing for those trips. So the focus of our work was very much on the public transport network. So within the strategy, it's recognised that without complementary demand management, the full benefits of the strategy will not be achieved. So Cicero Jacobs were commissioned by the NTA to prepare the demand management report. It comprised primarily a desktop review of transport demand management measures, both existing and also a key input was previous studies undertaken by the NTA and for the NTA, including the Greater Dublin Area Travel Demand Management Study that was prepared by Booz in 2004 for the then Dublin Transportation Office. So it primarily was focused on gathering together the existing knowledge within the NTA of the effectiveness and appropriateness of transport demand management for Dublin, and also building on the work undertaken previously in other studies, and also looking at recent developments in transport demand management. So primarily transport demand management is looking at influencing demand for transport in many different ways. But I suppose I've simplified it down to the key 4 aspects, which is looking at trying to reduce the need to travel, so trip reduction, trying to look at the potential for reduction in vehicle use, so the promotion of alternative transport to the private car mainly. I'm also looking at trip redistribution, which is focused on seeing if there's potential to shorten trip lengths. This comes in primarily within land use planning to look at providing for mixed use land use and allowing for local trips to be undertaken, as opposed to the need to travel longer distances to access services, employment, and so on. And then the final one being trip retiming. So where there is a choice for the user, be it a discretionary trip, or even if there's some flexibility in working practices, that we can try and take the pressure off that AM peak period and retime trips to get greater use, particularly out of the public transport network throughout the day, as opposed to purely within the AM peak. Transport demand management is multifaceted, and there's no one solution, and that's recognised within the strategy. It comprises a mixture of measures covering information and education, planning in terms of land use planning, and also transport planning, pricing, supply control such as car parking restraints, and fundamentally encouraging better alternatives for travel. So bearing that in mind, that there's not one simple solution within the report that we prepared and the work that we did, we grouped identified transport demand management measures into a number of different criteria. So they comprised land use measures, fiscal measures, looking at intelligent transport systems, so the likes of variable message signage, and also response systems that come in under ITS, traffic management, parking restraint, travel plans and awareness, which is a key area for the National Transport Authority, that they currently oversee the delivery of workplace travel planning and campus travel planning, and also the Greener Schools programme. Further measures to encourage sustainable travel, which is kind of a catch-all for anything that doesn't fit under anything else. New technologies, communications, information integration measures, and finally control measures. Now obviously there are some aspects of transport demand management that don't neatly fit into one of these categories. They could probably fit into a number, but they were broadly the groups that we used. Within the work itself, we undertook a detailed SWOT analysis. So we looked at the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities and the constraints for different options for transport demand management for the Greater Dublin area. And I won't go through them all tonight because there's actually quite a lot of them, but they are all detailed within the report itself. It's not that long a report, but there are a lot of measures that are included within it. That was done by the consultant team in coordination with the NTA. And which there were recommendations made on the transport demand management measures to be included within the strategy. So the report that was prepared informed the strategy itself. And these are some of the key transport demand management measures that are included within the final statutory document within the strategy itself. So the first being land use, which is to encourage land use density policies to support the provision of development in locations and at densities which enables the efficient provision of public transport services. I suppose a good example of this within the GDA area already is the Docklands, and in particular the changes that have happened around Grand Canal Dock Station since it opened, and also the fairly recent Docklands SDZ, which will provide for additional residential units and employment in that area, which is then underpinned by the accessibility of the area, both in terms of active modes, so walking, but also critically the public transport accessibility delivered primarily by the DART and Grand Canal Dock Station itself. There are a number of different transport demand management measures in the field of parking restraint, and I suppose this reflects how effective parking controls are in terms of influencing demand. They're highly effective, and there's also a benefit to employers and in terms of sustainable land use, in terms of minimizing the need for parking. So there's a financial implication for employers when they're looking for premises if they don't need to provide large quantities of parking. But in terms of the land use itself, minimizing the extent of parking is beneficial. So to set maximum parking standards, which has been progressively done over a number of years by the DTO and then the NTA and the local authorities, but to further develop that and to look at the level of parking provision that is right at a planning level. To also look at reducing the availability of workplace parking in urban centres where alternative transport options are available. And also to look at expanding on-street parking controls, both on-street and also in relation to out-of-town retail centres. So as you can see, in terms of the parking, it hits a number of different elements of the transport demand management. It links in with the planning. There's obviously the pricing elements of parking charges, and then the supply control itself, as in the effect that it has on that choice in how to travel, which fundamentally should lead to encouraging better alternatives for travel within the GDA. Also within the strategy, there's provision for demand management on the M50. I'm sure, as you're all aware, the capacity on the M50 is largely exhausted, and definitely is forecast to be so, in that, the congestion is increasing. And in fact, the NTA's analysis of the growth and demand on the M50 has shown, in particular in recent years, quite dramatic growth in car demand and car volumes on the M50. The management of the M50 does fall under the remit of TII, and it is recognised within the strategy that in order to address the M50 and its strategic context and its importance for the transport network in the GDA, that it will require an interagency solution to be derived for the management of what is a critical piece of infrastructure, and to ensure that it is sufficient to meet its strategic functions. And that's where the transport demand management measures will come into play. So the two main ones are to look at the general fleet of transport demand management on the M50 itself, but then also to look at potential transport demand management measures on the roads approaching the M50, so the national network leading into the M50 itself. It's not firmly defined within the strategy as to what those transport demand management measures will be, but they do include within the report that was prepared options for road tolling pricing, variable speed limits, variable message signing, incident detection systems, and also potentially ramp metering on the national road, on the routes, on the approaches to the M50. And finally, there's this suite of transport demand management that's included within the strategy relates to travel plans and awareness. This is an area that's had significant success in recent years. There are about 300,000 employees who are now participating in workplace management plans through the NTA, and probably a similar amount of students between the schools and the campus schemes. It's been shown, and there's been research done by the NTA, that there's variations in the success of travel planning, but it has ranged in between 10% and 30% reductions in car use, with an average of about 18%. So it's a sizable reduction in car use. When you consider the volume of trips, it's probably equivalent to a Lewis, I'd say, somewhere. Then they will save you a Lewis if you can get another 18% of people out of the car. So there's over 1,000 schools around the country that have participated as well, and the NTA would be hoping that they would have 100% of participation within schools in the GDA area. A challenging ambition. So within the travel awareness, it's to support and facilitate the expansion of the existing programs, so the workplace travel plans, and there's definitely scope for the number of companies that participate within that scheme, and also looking at tailored travel planning information provision for residential, commercial, retail areas, expanding the travel plans for schools and colleges and all education campuses, and also looking at car clubs, car pooling and car sharing schemes. So the transport demand management measures will ultimately support the strategy in delivering its objectives to provide for the growth in transport demand within the GDA area up to the life of the time of the strategy, and also to support that efficiency, both in terms of the sustainability of the strategy itself, but also the efficiency in terms of economy. And once again, back to what John Paul said earlier, there is an element of sweating the assets and getting best use out of the investment within the existing and the proposed transport network. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I will open the floor for questions for either myself or John Paul.
Sorry, John Paul. Just to note that we do have a number of online, so if you could just wait for the mic to get around to you. So I'll open the floor to questions. Anybody? Just raise your hand. Well, I might start it off then. John Paul, you mentioned that that the rollout of the models is going to happen over the next number of weeks. Is that correct, or
Yes.
what's the time frame for the delivery?
The time frame for delivery, I believe, is before the end of May. All going well with just getting local authorities just to agree a date with them. So yeah, I think the plan is to have a presentation, one in Dublin, Galway, Limerick, Cork and Waterford, on each of the regional models over the coming month or so.
Yeah, to the local authorities initially, and the sort of the primary stakeholders, and then it'll be opened up to the wider audience shortly thereafter.
Any more questions from the floor, Paul?
Paul Carroll from Jacobs. Just in relation to the figure you quoted, John Paul, regarding the, I think it was 100% of transport growth is to be accommodated by the modelling that was set out. Is that basically saying that there's no more roads whatsoever being built in the GDA over the lifetime of the strategy, or how is that? How does that work out?
Well, it's not necessarily about that no more roads will be built, but the key mover of people is to be public transport for trips greater than 3 kilometres is to be via public transport measures. As you're aware, I believe part of the M11 widening from 2 lanes to 3 lanes is still on the cards, and that's within the southeast corridor as well. So it's not an end to road building, but I'd say it's definitely a limiting.
Yeah, I mean, it was recognised within the strategy that, and I'm sure you'll all agree that within the city centre, within the M50, there's probably very, very limited opportunity for increasing road capacity. I mean, as you see from the corridor studies, it was primarily focused on trips to the city centre and those radial trips along the corridors, and within the M50 itself, there's very little opportunity for road schemes. But as John Paul outlined, the strategy does include for strategic road improvements and localised improvements that will need primarily to look after the strategic function of the road network. So to ensure that there's sufficient capacity for the movement of freight on those key roads such as the M11, but also the national road approaches to the M50 as well.
Thank you.
Have we any more questions?
Thanks. Since I got the mic, I might ask 2 questions. The first was to do with the modelling and PT and car-based. Was there any element included in the modelling for the other modes, the cycling and walking, to represent their potential within the Greater Dublin area as well?
Yes. So the active modes, cycling, walking, are included in the model. I suppose, however, for our study, again, focused on the trips greater than 3 kilometres. So again, the majority of them would be via either public transport or by car mode. Unfortunately, I do not have the figures for the active modes for the trips greater than 3 kilometres from our study area, within the study area and to the city centre. But yes, they are taken into account in the model.
And definitely there's going to be a relationship with the more PT we have, the more cycling we're going to get as a corresponding kind of relationship between the two as well. So I think it's positive in that respect. And the other question was related to the transport strategy itself in terms of the land use scenarios that were tested, or was land use scenarios included in the whole development of the transport strategy, or were they just one set land use strategy that we're trying to accommodate within the development of it?
Yeah, the land use strategies the land use was developed by the NTA in liaison with all the local authorities within the GDA, and it involved basically taking their input from and their forecast planning data, and basically the forecasts are based on the Central Statistics Office forecasts for population, employment, etc., and they align, or they convert that into their planning data to into their more disaggregate zoning system for their proposed developments, whether it's residential or employment, etc. And that was included in the strategy. So it was Well, it was one land use strategy. It is within the model, and basically based on the provision of infrastructure, because of the dynamic nature of or not the dynamic nature of the model, but the demand responses within the model. The origin and destination choice is affected as well based on the costs associated with the journeys being made. So you don't have a static origin and destination of a trip for every trip for each option. It varies based on the provision the public transport and infrastructure provided.
So the public transport provision, they would influence where people would live and where they would work.
Yeah.
And that was
But
reflected
not
in the model.
necessarily the quantum of development, which is the land use component which is going in.
Yeah, again, because it's, the PT provision needs the right land uses to support it. And I think you made a point about demand management. You need to have a certain scale and density to return. I was just wondering, was that embedded in the whole process? And it seems it was a key element to it. And then I have one last question that's got to do with the M50 and the demand management associated with that. Again, it's, basically it's the main mode that we use for getting around the city in orbital routes. Was there any fiscal measures included in the strategy itself for the M50, or was it just seen as it's congested as it is at the moment? So orbital routes will have to be, I suppose, entertained or serviced using the proposed orbital bus services.
The proposed multi-point tolls from the M50 demand management study were included in the model. To basically, I think the aim there is to kind of keep, dare I say, current levels as they are, and the provision of outer orbital bus services as well as inner orbital bus services were provided as alternatives within the strategy.
Yeah, without the transport demand management and the multi-point tolling, the prediction is that the traffic volumes on the M50 are likely to still increase even with the measures contained within the strategy, and that in order to manage that demand and to sort of to cap it at something that is operationally going to keep moving, that the multi-point tolling would need to be rolled out, which was the indication of the modelling. But that's a piece of work that will require further analysis as to plan exactly how, when and how much, but it is within the strategy itself. It's forecast to happen, I suppose, sooner rather than later in terms of the strategy programme.
That's great, thank you.
Okay, we'll just take one more question then.
Am I right in noting, as with most previous traffic studies in Dublin, the missing of the taxi element? The private public transport, as it were, which is increasingly, with taxi deregulation, Halo, and the coming Uber, becoming a very dramatic section of travel. It appears to be missing. Has it been, and if not, how is it being allowed for, particularly with Dublin being one of the few capital cities still without Uber, and it's obviously coming, and the effects where they're in are very, very dramatic. And it would appear under EU competition regulations to deny it much further is and will be anti-competitive. Comment?
Well, I suppose the taxis are modelled within they're modelled as a separate user class within the highways element within the road element of the transport model. They're not forecast independently to car demand. They represent a subset of that. So yeah, they're more a function of traffic demand rather than.
But it's quite probable that the mode split within public transport between buses, trams, etc., and cars and taxis would be greater than the transfer from cars to public transport postulated in the model.
I think in terms of delivering the level of growth that's needed, and to support that there would likely be issues in terms of capacity that could be provided for by taxis as opposed to the strategic schemes such as the Metro and DART. But it's not included within the strategy in the sense that there's still provision made for taxis, and there's no proposals for significant alterations to taxis.
If you double the occupancy of private cars, which Uber would do, you solve the traffic problem with no investment.
That's one to bring back.
Okay. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. Just thanks to John Paul and Sinead for a wonderful presentation this evening. Our next Roads and Transportation lecture is a bespoke one. Michael Nolan, from the CEO from TII, is coming in to give us a talk on the vision for the amalgamated TII, that is the NRA RPA. That is on the 18th of May, if you can plug it into your diaries. Just to thank everybody here for coming out tonight. I know it's a Champions League night and we try to avoid these on such occasions, but thank you all, and to thank those online. Just one final piece of business, just to call on my fellow committee member Paul Carroll to give the vote of thanks.
Thanks very much, John Paul, Sinead. I think that was a really good presentation. Brought a lot of new information to myself anyway. I know, I'm sure most other people here. I suppose a couple of things occurred to me when I was listening to you there. I suppose as someone who started out life as in the traffic and transportation field, I think having seen the complexity and the level of work that went into that model, I think that field is pretty much closed off to me now. So that's the first thing that occurred to me. It's really impressive, the multidisciplinary aspect to it. You know, it wasn't just, I don't think, 2 or 3 guys sitting in a room plugging numbers into a traffic model. There's a massive amount of work went into that. So it looks like an interesting project to have worked on. I suppose the other thing, kind of a broader thing that occurred to me, I suppose as a citizen, as a taxpayer, to see the level of assessment and investigation that went into the various different proposals, I suppose it's quite reassuring. I mean, the funding and the financing of infrastructure is you know, fairly topical with Irish Water and everything else that's happening. So to see the level of detail and the kind of robustness of what the NTA have put together there is really impressive. So I think you communicated that work really well to us here tonight. So on behalf of the committee and on behalf of the people here tonight and online, thanks very much.